Good evening, and welcome to the University of Chicago. I'm Poast, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, and your host for this evening's event, Talking Trump, Conversation, Context, and Controversy. Tomorrow, Donald J. Trump will be inaugurated as the 45th President of the United States. The unprecedented nature of his election, the campaign preceding that election, and the transition following that election raises a host of questions for many people. Not only those who oppose his election, but also for those who supported his election. These questions include, how are we to understand his election, both within the scope of U.S. presidential politics and globally? To what extent will Trump's presidency be unique to him, be indistinguishable from the presidency of any other Republican candidate, or be reflective of forces and trends, both international and domestic, that are present regardless of whether a Democrat or Republican were in office? What does this election say about the condition of the United States on a host of social and economic issues? What can we expect to observe, both domestically and internationally, over the duration of a Trump presidency? In short, how can we think and talk about a Trump presidency? To help us in that task, before you is a panel of 7 esteemed members of the Social Science Division here at the University of Chicago. Cathy Cohen, the David and Mary Winton Green Professor of Political Science. Lis Clemens, the William Rainey Harper Professor of Sociology. Adam Green, Associate Professor of American History. Pape Hillis, Assistant Professor of Russian History. Joseph Masco, Professor of Anthropology. Casey Mulligan, Professor of Economics. And Robert Pape, Professor of Political Science. Before I turn it over to the panelists, I would like to describe the flow of tonight's event. Tonight's event is divided into 3 parts. First, each panelist will offer initial remarks on tonight's topic from the perspective of their own area of expertise. Second, Cathy Cohen will then moderate a roundtable discussion amongst the panelists. Third, the audience will then have an opportunity to pose questions to the panelists. If you have a question, I will offer instructions after the initial remarks on how you can go about asking your question. So be on the lookout for that. Again, thank you for being here this evening. Cathy, would you like to begin the initial remarks?
Yes, I would. How's everybody doing? You nervous? Not about the panel, about tomorrow, right? Okay. So first, as Paul said, I just want to remind everyone, we're each going to do 5 minutes, then we're going to have a discussion. Less moderated by me, and really more a discussion. And then you get to come into the discussion, hopefully. So let me start with my 5 minutes. First, I want to thank Paul and Renee for their incredible work in pulling this event together. I think the need to talk collectively about the political environment we are entering is evident in the number of folks who showed up this evening. But before talking about President-elect Trump, I feel like I would be remiss if I did not note that this is the last full day of President Obama's administration. I know, yeah. And what is especially, I guess, mind-boggling, at least for me at this moment, is that our first African-American president is handing over the levers of power to a person who has trafficked in race-mongering and racism. We must always remember that Trump was the candidate who called Mexican immigrants rapists and murderers. He suggested a federal judge could not do his job because of his Mexican heritage. He repeatedly described black communities, largely to white audiences, as sites of crime and danger. Trump was the candidate who propelled the birther conspiracy about President Obama, and who called for the death penalty for the Central Park five young black men accused of beating and raping a white woman who were eventually exonerated. And now Donald Trump is about to become the first president since Reagan, not to include one Latino American in his cabinet. I could, of course, go on. But beyond Trump's use of racism to secure his position in the White House, I think we have to ask really to what degree white voters were primed to vote for someone like Trump, and fundamentally against Obama and the changing demographics and shifting power that the president represents. For many white Americans, the election of Barack Obama in 2008 had important symbolism. His election signaled to whites both the possibility of a post-racial America, but also the possibility and maybe the promise of a dreaded shift in power, robbing them of one of the last domains of supremacy they could claim, political power at the highest level. Historian Robin Kelley, in his thoughtful piece in the Boston Review, reminds us that there is often a white lash that follows the expansion of rights and power for people of color. Reconstruction, he suggests, is one example. Nixon's law and order candidacy and after the anti-war and civil rights movement is another. And today, following the election of Barack Obama in 2008 and his re-election in 2012, we may in fact be experiencing yet another. The truth, of course, that we now have to face and make sense of is that Donald Trump, whatever your opinion about him, won this election because of his support that he secured from white Americans. According to exit polls, by a margin of nearly 2-to-1, white men, both college-educated and non-college educated, voted for President-elect Trump. But it wasn't, of course, just white men. We also know from exit polls that the majority of white women, specifically non-college educated white women, also voted for Trump. And yes, let's make sure we're clear on this, the plurality of young whites, white millennials, ages 18 to 30, also voted for Trump. Thus, there is kind of no avoiding the fact that Donald Trump was delivered to the White House on the votes of white Americans, like nearly every other Republican president since the 60s. And it is really the predictability of that white vote, even when facing what many of us consider to be a racist candidate like Donald Trump, that is in some ways most jarring about this election and the racial and political climate that we now confront. The threat isn't just Donald Trump for many of us, as the media might tell you. It is also of the political populace that would elect Donald Trump. Now, there are, of course, those who argue that this election was about the economic anxieties of the white working class and, in fact, not their racism. They admit that clearly messages of hate were part of Trump's rhetoric, but they would have us focus our attention instead on the economic pain of the white working class as the driver of the Trump vote. Let me say that, of course, in addition to insisting that we pay attention to both racism and sexism when trying to understand this election, I also agree that economic insecurity is also something we must attend to and interrogate. However, we make a mistake if we understand the election of Donald Trump as purely a phenomenon of the white working class resonating to a populist message. Specifically, the research tells us that white Americans' economic insecurity is directly tied to their feelings of status and racial loss. My own quantitative research indicates that it is very difficult to strip the racism and sexism inherent in the Trump message from its economic populism. Thus, even when you talk of economic issues, they are often heard through the lens of race and gender. So when you couple the prospect of racial loss with the looming changes in the economic security of all Americans, especially the working class and poor, it is not surprising that so many white voters would gravitate to the promise of making America great again. Making America great again. Many long for the ability to turn back the clock to a time when the racial order was leveraged to dependently situate whites on top, or at least preserve the myth of white supremacy for the working class and poor whites. So any analysis, I believe, of this election and how we think about together how to move forward has to address issues of racism and racial anxiety of white people broadly, not just the white working class. However, I would warn Democrats and progressives, not to gloat, of course, and not, in fact, to center whiteness unwittingly in an economic appeal, since doing so may further increase the racism and sexism that currently divides the country and mask the reality of the real working class, which every day is increasingly comprised of people of color. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Cathy for starting us off so well, and to both Paul, Renee, and all of you for making this possible. Keep your government hands off my Medicare, demanded the Tea Party in 2009. This same distrust of the federal government can be heard from conservative Southerners who resent federal protection of the natural landscapes that they deeply love. According to Arlie Hochschild, her informants see themselves, quote, waiting in line for something you really want at the end, the American dream. You feel a sense of great deserving. You've worked very hard. Then you see some people cut in line. Well, who were they? They are affirmative action women who would go for formerly all men's jobs, or affirmative action blacks who have been sponsored and now have access to formerly all white jobs. It's immigrants, it's refugees, as felt, the lines moving back. In this telling, the federal government is the ally of those who cut ahead in line, the enemy of those who are just trying to do their jobs and get ahead. This resentment of government is not new to American politics, but it is newly and forcefully salient following the election. So the question I want to wrestle with is, what should we expect from a government that drew elected in substantial, if not entire part, and empowered by resentment of government? The obvious answer would seem to be that government will become smaller and weaker. This has already begun. Some cabinet nominees have opposed the agencies they will soon lead. Legislation enabling the repeal of the Affordable Care Act is in motion. Less noticed are more technical calls to limit the use of the tax code as a policy instrument, or to expand the ability of the courts at all levels to challenge regulations promulgated by federal agencies. These developments point to important reallocations and rearrangements of authority among federal agencies, between state and federal government, as well as with private firms and nonprofit organizations. But we should not forget that resentment of government also drove support for a candidate who presented himself as a strong leader who will do things, presumably with government in some way. Build a wall, renegotiate trade treaties, guarantee health insurance for all. Like American conservatives of all flavors, Trump contends that government is too large, too intrusive, and inferior to free markets. His promise is for a new approach to government that, at some point, may indeed involve a return to the expanded forms of executive action for which Obama has been repeatedly attacked. When combined with the policy moves in Congress, the Trump administration may or may not produce a government that is smaller, but it is also likely to produce a government that is more complex, more decentralized, less transparent, and less accountable. Now, all of this can be, foreseen in at least a probabilistic way. These are likely developments. But none of it quite gets at the strangeness of keep your government hands off my Medicare, or the puzzle of why those Obamacare beneficiaries in Kentucky voted for the candidate who promised to repeal the program that had provided them with access to much-needed medical care. This puzzle really turns on how people to come to oppose programs from which they seem to benefit. And precisely this strangeness is important for assessing how the intention to create a smaller, weaker government will or will not translate into change in federal policy and institutions. 4 points help us to think about this. The first is that as a set of institutions that have been built within an often anti-statist political culture, the federal government we have is often difficult to identify. It operates indirectly in many ways through contracts, transfers, and tax expenditures. As a consequence, many citizens do not recognize when they benefit from federal programs, such as the tax subsidies for mortgage interest or employment-based health insurance, or even in the case of Kentucky, the state-level exchange, which was known as Connect, not as healthcare.gov. And when they are not recognized, federal benefits do not trigger policy feedbacks through which public programs generate a supporting constituency. Social Security is a third rail in American politics, precisely because senior citizens know exactly where that check is coming from. Finally, we know from social psychology that losses are felt more powerfully than equivalent gains. Therefore, straightforward effort to shrink or eliminate streams of federal benefits may generate new and unpredictable waves of protest and mobilization. So what's likely to follow from all of this? Efforts to directly roll back federal government that impact large numbers may quickly generate substantial opposition, as well as hesitation on the part of lawmakers who fear political backlash. This is already evident around the repeal and replacement of Obamacare, where the legislative timetable is stretching out. So to avoid this volatility, we should expect proposed changes to move ever deeper into the weeds, into the world of technical detail where politicization is less likely and requires more work, although it's certainly not impossible. Recall how the Affordable Care Act could be reframed as a government takeover of health care or a minor amendment to Medicare relabeled as death panels. But nevertheless, the move into technical detail provides some cover from backlash to attempting to restrict or eliminate benefits. And I'll leave it with this, to the extent that projects of political change and rolling back of federal action remain hidden in the weeds, overshadowed by a contentious politics of outrage and emotion and the latest event, they are more likely to succeed and thereby to actually respond to the hopes of those who see government as the problem rather than as a solution to the problems.
So let me speak frankly, if predictably at the start. I'm concerned about what's to come for our political system, our civil society, and a broader human community with the transition to a Trump presidency and administration starting tomorrow. And it would not be honest on my part, speaking only for myself, to affect a sense of scholarly detachment in trying to clarify and hopefully convey my reasons for that concern. So I will try to speak basically in order to convey the stakes of the moment. Predictions about the future, as well as explanations that might comprehensively take stock of the past, strike me to be presumptive, likely incomplete, and not really up to the magnitude of the challenges that appear on the horizon. One question that strikes me as difficult to answer is whether what has taken place is an extraordinary and unprecedented exercise in personal promotion, self-branding, auto-enactment of a well-known individual who wins so much you grow sick of it, or the turn towards a discernible politics, either new or restored, on the part of an appreciable portion of the American people. The web journal Politico has run a fascinating serial interview since June of last year with 4 biographers of Trump: Wayne Barrett, Michael D'Antonio, Gwenda Blair, and Tim O'Brien, that argues the first point. In ways that only someone who, somehow, endured hours of interviews with Trump and his close associates to present something approaching a complete life portrait can do, these writers argue that there's nothing behind the story save unbridled ego, obsessive and Olympian insecurity, and an inexhaustible Rolodex, or more appropriately, smartphone address log, devoted to the art of the vendetta rather than the deal. To search for a coherent politics, to say nothing of a stable psychology within this improbable ascension, is a fruitless endeavor, according to these writers who, with the exception of family, may know him best and with far less obligation or dependency. But this does not explain the surprising yet effective support that Trump has secured through this election and the power that now transfers to him. There have been many versions of what characterizes and potentially unifies this coalition into an effective constituency, in defiance of parties, rules of civility, and the preference of experts. More emphatic characterizations of racial supremacy, toxic misogyny, or homophobia, and the insistent incivility around all of those evoke some, but not necessarily all, portions of this constituency. Like a number of observers, I see the politics and feeling of Trump perhaps better characterized as illiberal, indifferent to the necessity of dividing and thereby limiting authority, opposed to the utility of moderation, whether through deliberative processes, rule of law in society, or evidence in thought, unconcerned ultimately with upholding the immunity of individuals and groups from undue domination. To be sure, critiques of liberalism in practice for failing to realize these same ideals or aspirations abound, so much so that at times we have been compelled to see little difference between the existence of liberal society and its absence. The coming years promise to enable us to test out that proposition in real time. A number of writers have recently proposed that we should have seen this coming all along. Historian David Greenberg, also writing in Politico, traced the long history of so-called paleoconservatism back to anxieties over the progressive state, immigrant pluralism, and the rise of urban elites in education, media, and the arts. While never able to, at least until now, assume power, paleoconservatism ceaselessly sought outlets to challenge a perceived liberal status quo in public life, whether through creationism, pro-segregation, or mid-century isolationism. Others, like Mike Davis and Jedediah Purdy, stress more recent wellsprings of discontent within the social order, particularly the white working class that Cathy spoke of, in communities that contain remnants of this industrial working class. To their detriment, these writers argue both major parties ignored the needs of this community or took for granted their support, leaving the field fully available to an audacious outsider. I see something potentially broader at work. We need to remember that 2016 was a devastating year for those that champion liberal institutions and norms, and not just because of Brexit and the American elections. The brutal perseverance, for instance, of Assad in Syria is perhaps the most overt demonstration of how strongman authority can guarantee continuity of power. But there are other examples, from Erdogan in Turkey, who has, it must be remembered, presided over the jailing of scores of thousands of teachers, writers, civil servants, and jurists in the wake of the July coup attempt, or Duterte in the Philippines, whose bloody campaign to control drug addiction by eliminating drug addicts recently won the endorsement of Trump as the right way. And of course, there is Putin, whose rise to power has involved fake news, assaults on the press, incursions on sovereign nations, and the jailing or elimination of rivals. The active alignment of the incoming president with many of these peers and their records seems to me to be telling. My worry then is that we are watching a slow yet steady dissolution of a liberal order. There may be good reasons to hold that same order responsible for its present crisis, but we need to contemplate how deeply we may miss it if it goes away. One source, or hope, and possibly one great irony, is that it may be more radical forms of social activism, even more so than entrenched forms of liberal leadership, that offer the possibility of defending that order and better renovating it. Thank you.
For months now, we've been puzzling over the nature of the relationship between Putin and Trump. From the beginning, many assumed that Trump's admiration for Putin was directed by some kind of quid pro quo. And of course, these suspicions deepened last week with the release of this salacious dossier. We can be certain that Russia has compiled a thick folder of compromising information on Trump during his many visits to Russia. It would be shocking if this did not actually exist. But of course, we don't know the exact role that this plays in Trump's calculus. But I'm actually not entirely convinced that the Trump-Putin relationship is driven primarily or exclusively by bribery or entrapment. There seem to be more structural issues at play, and that's what I will focus on tonight, unpacking what Trump sees in Putin, what Putin sees in Trump, and what this means for all of us. I think that Trump's interest in Putin is as much about domestic affairs as it is about the international realm, and I see it as primarily aspirational. In other words, I believe that Trump sees Putin as the type of man and leader he'd like to be. And so in telling us of this admiration, he's giving us cues about what he plans, and I think we should take him very seriously at his word. What does Trump admire in Putin? First, and perhaps most important, Putin is fantastically rich. He may in fact be one of the richest men in the world. Over the last 15 years, he's systematically stripped Russia's resources, acquiring a vast personal fortune in the billions. Second, Putin is an autocrat. He has destroyed all institutions and individuals capable of critiquing him. And third, in spite of his destruction actions, Putin enjoys wide popular acclamation. He's done this in part by mobilizing the Russian people against scapegoats. I'll point to the LGBT population in particular. But he also does this through a distinctive, surreal communication style that obfuscates, distracts, and misleads to make Russians question the basic reality around them. There are already disturbing signs that Trump hopes to emulate Putin's authoritarian kleptocracy here in the US and to bolster it through the kinds of tricks that Putin has used. I could point to his refusal to divest from his businesses, his attacks on the free press and nonpartisan watchdogs, as well as the cheering section of loyal staffers whom he brought along to his press conference last week. All of these are taken straight out of Putin's playbook. And indeed, the people I know who work on and in Russia are among the most alarmed voices out there, and that is because we've seen this show before. So I think we should take this very seriously. This is not about partisan politics. I see a grave threat to our democratic institutions. Putin's interest in Trump, by contrast, is not at all personal. Putin has no regard for Trump as a leader or a human. Rather, Trump is a tool to achieve a much longer-term geopolitical strategy that Putin's been pursuing for some time now. Russia lost badly in the global order that emerged from the Cold War, and Putin has clearly concluded that Russia cannot flourish so long as it remains on the margins of the international system. But until recently, he's had a problem, and that problem is that Russia is too weak to combat the global order head-on. Its economy is in sharp contraction, and its military is strong compared to its neighbors, but it's not competitive with the US, NATO, or China. Therefore, Putin has been very effectively challenging the international order indirectly by working to undermine its most powerful players. He's funded white nationalist and Eurosceptic parties across the world. He's engaged in hacking and disinformation campaigns to sow mistrust in institutions and governments, not only in the US, also in other locales. And this is where Trump comes in, right? Because Trump is one of the most powerful forces of destabilization the world has seen in decades. By virtue of the power of his office, he can do much more to destroy the prestige of America and undermine the entire international system than Putin ever could. But I also want to be very clear that this is not only about Trump. Say, for example, Trump is immediately impeached. Well, this is still an excellent outcome for Putin, because this whole affair will have reduced America's standing in the world and made Americans question their institutions. So what happens next? In the short term, I think we're likely to see Trump doing Putin's bidding. He's already floated the idea of dropping sanctions against Russia, which will immediately implement a huge panic in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. But I want to draw particular concern to two other issues. One is the joint US-Russia assaults on the EU and NATO that we are already seeing being launched. This imperils the future of liberal democracy across Europe, especially in Germany and France. And particularly disastrous for the stability of the international order here would be the demise of NATO, which has enacted mutual defense guarantees that have kept us from being in a 19th century geopolitical world of might makes right. My second major concern is nuclear weapons, and this is an issue that's actually gone under the radar, buried by this other bad news. Consistently since the 80s, Trump has floated the ideas of joint US-Russia nuclear cooperation to police the world. And I think in practice, what he may be talking about here is actually a nuclear strike against a third party, in this case, likely ISIS. We haven't even begun to contemplate the grave consequences that this would bring. So the threats facing us are unprecedented, but I do want to end on a more hopeful note. It's critical that we remember that the rhetoric and actions of Putin and Trump are both weapons of the weak. Putin's tactics are highly effective at tearing down systems. They're not effective at building them up. And in fact, he's shown a chronic tendency to overextend himself. Likewise, we need to remember that Trump resorts to his authoritarian fantasies precisely because he can't govern through more conventional means. He enters office with historically low approval ratings, he has no understanding of how the policymaking process works, and he has no loyal inner circle close to him except those related to him. And ironically, I think that his love of Putin may end up being his Achilles heel if he has one. I think if our democracy can survive in the short term, this may actually be the issue that topples him. So the most important thing moving forward as of tonight is that we not comply in advance. Trump will not succeed in emulating Putin at home if we don't permit him. If you're feeling outraged tonight, stay outraged. If you feel that your reality is being questioned, hold your line. Psychological refusal to capitulate to the system that is designed to make you feel small and hopeless is the first step toward resistance. Thank you.
Well, it's hard to follow that statement. We had some similar interest in the question of the production of reality effects and the kind of accusation that we're living in a kind of post-truth moment. And you hit on a number of the themes that I was hoping to talk about as well. But maybe I could put a little bit of it in context in the American domain and the fact that Trump inherits a set of rhetorical structures, media strategies that have been built up over quite a number of years now. And I would refer people to the kind of historic interview that Ron Suskind did in 2004 in the midst of the war on terror with an unnamed Bush administration figure that was most likely Karl Rove, in which Karl Rove, or the anonymous figure, accused Ron Suskind, the journalist, of being in the so-called reality-based community. And he suggested that those in power were now no longer interested in reality-based arguments, but that they were so powerful that they could create their own reality. And I thought that what we see in Trump is an acceleration and expansion of the confidence in that maneuver, that one can shift registers, change the context, disavow formal statements, run a campaign that breaks every kind of political norm, that runs on division as opposed to inclusion, that seeks literally to divide and make a promissory note to the country that the country isn't actually for everyone, it's for a designated minority. And also that it feeds into the two large-scale issues that in my own work I've been concerned about over the last couple decades, which has to do with nuclear crisis and climate crisis. And both of these domains in the US have been subject to radical image manipulation, campaigns in which expertise, science, factual information about the nature of the danger or possible policy response to it have often been captured by political mobilizations of fear on a particular level. If we can just remember the early moments in 2000 in which the world was filled with literally proliferating and expansive threats of every kind, threats that had never happened before, a world in which literally, under the logic of critical national infrastructure, every post office box in the country was positioned as a threat to national security and an object that might need some kind of special protection from a new form of policing power, a new kind of technical expertise. And in the midst of that grand exercise in threat proliferation, a whole set of national policies were passed that had very little to do with the war on terror, but changed the nature of our financial universe in very significant ways, that also played on resisting the emerging evidence around climate change and collective environmental danger, that sought to repress science in a very direct way in the key agencies of government devoted to studying the environment, to even restrict those instruments, scientific instruments of surveillance that enable greater and more detailed understandings of collective environmental conditions. And so when Trump announces that he will, on the one hand, be very interested in expanding the nuclear program, and on the other hand, disavowing any interest in climate change, he inherits a set of moves and threat amplifications and resistances to questions of fact and scientific authority that are already in our political system. And so he's not inventing those particular problems, but he is accelerating them. And I think, Faith, your comment on the Russian tactic of using confusion as a strategic political technique is something that I think Trump is definitely bringing into the American political space where it's actually very difficult to know what the policies might actually be, right? That there are so many positions taken, so many threats amplified, so many shifts in perspective, that what we actually are witnessing is the production of a space where political discourse is about disinformation. It's literally about making it impossible to have the conversation about what were once the key strategic national security concerns of the moment, in which multiple forms of expertise had to combat one another and come up with policy moves that could be collectively embraced. So the key things to look for, I think, in the coming year with the first acts of the Trump administration is definitely what happens at the EPA. There's a concerted effort there, I think, to eliminate the job of the EPA, and with that to restrict and control the kind of work going on the collective environment. And then secondarily, on nuclear concerns, Trump is very interested in building the nuclear complex. He suggests that it's old and out of date. It is, and actually the Obama administration set the Department of Energy on a 30-year course to rebuild the entire nuclear complex. New weapons, new missiles, new launch vehicles. The best estimate is that it's maybe $1 trillion commitment over the next 30 years. So Trump is entering into a world that has already embraced the idea of renuclearization, and we have a real problem here, I think, in managing a world of disinformation and of strategic confusion when certain kinds of dangers will reassert the fact-based world in a hyper-violent kind of way. Nuclear danger is one, but of course climate change is producing multiple effects across every ecosystem and in every part of the planet. And I suspect that some of our billionaire members of cabinet with their oceanfront properties will eventually come to be deep believers in climate change, but it may not happen formally this year. So I hope many people in the room can hear differently perhaps the campaign of threat amplification and also of scientific denial, and to understand those are precisely about buying time for something else to happen politically, something else probably not named, and to be very wary of the political uses of disinformation, confusion, and to fight for those facts. Thank you.
Okay, it's my pleasure to be here today, really every day in the Social Sciences Division of the University of Chicago. It's my pleasure to hear what people are thinking, what they're publishing. Did you know that we have 30 weeks of class a year and most of our competitors only have 26? I love that. And they could charge me tuition, really, but I've shared that with you. Don't tell my chairman or the development office, okay? So let me get into the pieces that I've been seeing, what's been happening lately. I draw a distinction between tangibles and intangibles. That's a distinction. I think intangibles are very important. You're not a person if you don't put value on intangibles. In politics, even beyond the personal life, in the politics, intangibles are even more important because a typical person has essentially no individual incentive to vote or participate on the basis of tangible benefits. Back to the personal life. I buy Coke Classic, and like a lot of people, I don't really care if the scientists tell me it's the same chemical as Pepsi or the same chemical as some generic cola. The intangibles are important to me. When I watch Star Wars, I root against Darth Vader, okay? Now, if I ran into the actor on the street, he's probably a nice guy or whatever, but I'm rooting against him in the theater. It's the same thing, you're watching Shakespeare or reading a fiction book. So what if Othello isn't historically accurate? People like it, okay? That the intangibles are important. But I don't want to also make the mistake of saying that the tangibles are irrelevant. Have you heard that the parable of the pet food company that was launching that new dog food brand? They got the best advertising, they got the best scientists to make sure that the ingredients would make, for shiny fur and good eyes and strong teeth. They got a world-class distribution network, but the product wasn't selling. the executives, they puzzled over this. They decided, okay, we got to call in all the salesmen in the nation, and we got to tell them, how the marketing's supposed to work here. Maybe they don't understand. And then they were lecturing the salesmen. Salesmen were supposed to sit there and listen. But one lady in the back from Arkansas was raising her hand, and they finally broke down. The CEO broke down and called on the lady, and she says, what are we supposed to do when the dogs don't like it? And the experts dismissed her at first, but then they brought in some dogs, and they realized that even the hungry dogs don't eat the stuff. So they got rid of that product, to their credit, finally. A little better late than never. Well, President Obama was selling stimulus and Obamacare and not dog food. I understand that. But the point's the same. The so-called stimulus didn't stimulate. Obamacare was supposed to jumpstart the economy. It did the opposite. I brought a chart with me today, but in that chart, I showed the labor market for the last 10 years. And after a recession, normally you get a sharp bounce back. But from 2010 to 2013, the labor market was barely growing. And then what you see at the end of 2013, something happened. A real recovery is starting to begin. What happened there? Well, if we click the next one, we see what happened. The stimulus finally ended. The thing that was supposed to be growing the economy, we actually got to grow when it ended. Then after that, the Obama administration started taxing employers. As part of their plan to create jobs, they tax employers. And guess what? The recovery stopped. And then more recently, about 12 months ago, they started doing the full tax on the employers. And we're even less growth in the labor market. Remember how the pet food company finally realized that the dogs don't like it? Well, the Obama administration should have got the clue in 2010 already when Scott Brown won. No, they didn't. More bad product followed, like we've seen here. And by 2014, you had dozens and dozens and dozens of senators and congressmen who signed those laws who lost their jobs. The dogs didn't like it. Mrs. Clinton refused to acknowledge that the product was bad. Not to mention some FBI investigations and things like that. And so as a result, she and her party gave her opponent, whoever that would be, a huge advantage. All that opponent had to do was to repudiate the bad product and to enjoy that advantage. And of course, what did Trump do? Almost every campaign day, talk about how he's going to repeal Obamacare and repeal executive orders and take the product off the shelf. And when you are given a huge advantage of something, you have room to squander it. And candidate Trump had room to squander some of that advantage, and if he didn't squander too much, he could still win. So Mrs. Clinton and her party created plenty of space for an opponent to be, I don't know how I should say it, racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. He could be all those things and still win because of the advantage that they gave him by having a bad product. And so now it looks like what's going to happen, perhaps, Trump's hard to predict, but it looks like he's going to get credit to all those people out there who don't like the product. He's going to get credit for taking the product off the shelf. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Robert Pape. I have been studying international security affairs among states and among terrorist groups for about 30 years. And so I want to talk about Trump and the international liberal order. That set of institutions, the military, economic, and political institutions that we built mainly for Europe and Asia after World War II, and that for 70 years, as others on the panel have said, have stood in the way of major power conflict, especially in Europe and Asia. Well, the bottom line that I'm going to leave you with today is that I believe the Trump presidency is presenting the biggest challenge to the international liberal order that we have faced since its creation in the 1950s. Although we could continue to hope that President Trump would behave differently than as candidate or president-elect, we should realize that Trump has consistently, and indeed as recently as just this week, called NATO obsolete. openly supported the disintegration of the European Union, repeatedly disparaged major free trade agreements, and has plans for executive orders for aggressive anti-immigration policies to start as early as tomorrow. In effect, he is suggesting that the United States would be better off, that is, more secure, if we wall ourselves off from much of the world, including Europe and Asia, not just Mexico. So, what do we expect is going to happen? Thankfully, there are a number of major IR theories that can usefully explain the consequences of such policies. In particular, there are variants of realism that focus on capabilities and intentions in institutional theories, but also, thankfully, they all point in the same direction, so I don't have to go through all of them point by point by point. We have a situation of rare agreement among these major theories, and I'm afraid it is not a positive outcome. So let's examine Trump's stated policies in context to get the full picture. The international liberal order that we're talking about, these institutions, have been built on top of long-standing American security commitments, those commitments to Europe and Asia that are represented not just by treaties, but by the deployments of troops to Europe and Asia. It is the deployment of those troops that have enabled NATO, the GATT, now the WTO, and regional integration to flourish, because those troops, more than any paper promises, mean the United States, as the world's sole superpower, will spend its own blood to defend those countries. Now, even before Trump, the U.S. commitments to Europe and Asia have been declining. And if I can get a chart up, this shows you the U.S. commitment of troops to Europe and Asia pretty much over the last 70 years. And what you see is that during the Cold War, we committed every day 300,000 U.S. troops to Europe and 100,000 U.S. troops to Japan and South Korea. This is not just a paper promise. Then, after the Cold War ended, this started to decline. In the 1990s, the numbers fall to 100K in Europe, 80K in Asia, that is Japan and South Korea. And then after 9/11, the next shock to the system, even further. At the same time, America has ratcheted up its commitment to the Middle East, especially the Persian Gulf, in the fight against terrorism. Trump is merely continuing these trends, more aggressively to be sure, but these are trends that have been going on now for decades. For our allies, many were already worried before Trump about our commitment to Europe and Asia. After the election of Trump, Germany's Angela Merkel probably best summarizes the reaction of all of our key allies when she said in her first public press conference, and I quote, "We got the message. We Europeans are on our own." That's really striking. Now, what are those consequences? In Europe, the most important is likely to be the awakening of German military power. With the declining American commitment to Europe, there are obvious incentives for conventional, possibly nuclear buildups by Germany vis-a-vis Russia. We have already been watching German and Russian rivalry in Ukraine. This could easily expand into Eastern Europe in the near term. In Asia, we would likely have a worse version of Europe, with less and less Chinese cooperation and declining U.S. commitments to Japan and South Korea, leading to multiple intra-Asian rivalries, both with Japan and South Korea vis-a-vis China and even with each other. In the Middle East, now here there is some hope because a U.S.-Russian deal on Syria would help stabilize at least part of that country. However, there's also lots of complexity, and we could easily see conflict spiral out of control as Russia, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran all vie for their own individual spheres of influence, which is what we have been witnessing in the last 4 months, as we know. What this means is more instability under Trump, not less, especially in Europe and Asia, which have not been experiencing this significantly under Obama. So all this complaining about this instability under Obama, this is going to get worse, ladies and gentlemen. Trump is also likely to experience something Obama did not have to contend with, which is pushback, strong pushback from our own now allies as they are sucked into spiraling conflicts in their region without the U.S. by their side. Trump has suggested that the U.S. would return if needed, but it will be much harder to rush back into a crisis, and we should not expect to be welcomed with open arms. The cost of American intervention in ongoing spirals of conflict in Europe and Asia is going to be much higher than preventing them in the first place. That's the future we face. Now, finally, closed borders on the domestic front also have the potential to further diminish America's global image, but without addressing the security and economic concerns that are purported to motivate them. While Trump has highlighted fighting ISIS as a vital security threat, his proposed Muslim ban and discussion of a registry do little to address the true security threat of attacks in the United States. A soon-to-be-released study by my center, the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, highlights that out of the 112 individuals indicted in American courts in the last several years for ISIS-related crimes, a mere 3 of those 112 were refugees. 62% were American-born citizens, and on top of that, 30% were recent converts to Islam. So even banning 100% of Muslims is not going to stop the threat. Overall, Trump's plans for Fortress America are likely to damage our long-term security. Today, we are the world's sole superpower with many strong friends and the respect of even powerful rivals like China and Iran. The key question is, will we still be the sole superpower after Trump? Thank you.
So I was going to say again, I want to remind people I want to remind the panelists in particular, this is light moderation. So I'll start off with a question or two, and then hopefully we'll have a conversation amongst each other. I was taking notes. I enjoyed every presentation, but let me start with maybe two. Casey, you know I was going to come to you. One of the things I know from looking at quantitative data and doing my own surveys, in particular with millennials, is that overwhelmingly we see that people don't necessarily want to reject Obamacare. They want to reform Obamacare. And also your analysis seems to suggest that Obamacare and the issue of Obamacare drove voter decision. So I was wondering if you could maybe just elaborate a bit more. And I know you didn't mean to equate voters with dogs, but that's okay. You're an economist, you can get away with it, I guess. But if you could elaborate a bit more about kind of your thinking, and maybe also what does this mean for a Trump presidency? Do we assume that, in fact, when he, destroys, let's say, or rejects or rescinds Obamacare, and maybe there's nothing there, that he automatically gets the credit, as you may have suggested? So why don't maybe start there.
It's been my impression that since Lehman failed, 2008 fall, jobs has been the #1 concern of many, many Americans. Not all, but very many of them. And they did a stimulus that promised jobs, and it did the opposite. Even if you don't think it did the opposite, it was sure hard to see that it was doing what it supposedly did. That can make people angry. Then what did they do? They tried to tackle jobs in another way? No, they did the healthcare thing. That disturbs a lot of people. even when it's not jobs that they're in front of their thing. And then it was sold that, yeah, we're going to be giving you jobs at the same time we're going to be giving you health care. And then the cat got out of the bag, and everybody admits now that Obamacare destroys jobs. It may be worth destroying some jobs to have some health care is now the argument, but it was sold to us as, you know, that job thing that you really care about, well, we're going to help you with it. No, we're going to actually slap you in the other direction. And there's a lot of people that are bothered by that. And Trump, I think, knows his market. And it's not an accident. He didn't randomly roll a dice every day he was out on campaign and say, oh, dice come up Obamacare, I'm going to do Obamacare. He knew that played very well. And I think there's some tangible reasons why it played very well and also some intangible reasons.
Does anybody else want to?
I think with Obamacare in particular, one thing to notice is looking sort of beyond aggregate effects to particular segments that were hit hard, particularly Americans making above the level for subsidies but still not feeling comfortable being required to get better insurance than they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. They would have taken the risk and possibly been one of that percentage of families that went bankrupt because of medical crises that Elizabeth Warren studied. But there is a group that traded off that was pushed and required to trade off a possibility of catastrophic medical costs versus the certainty of paying more than they would have otherwise.
That's right.
And I think there was a voting effect there.
Yeah. But it could have been, it's limited, and it's not clear that the voting effect was what drove the vote. But I mean, it could have been part of a stacked process. Right. Can I just, and then I'll turn it over to you guys, but Faith, and maybe others on the panel, I want to, we've heard kind of repeated presentations about kind of, in many ways, the danger that Trump holds. And again, if you look at the data, people generally are worried about kind of the practice of democracy and democratic norms, right? The ability for individuals to dissent, the role of the press to hold the president-elect, soon to be president, accountable. And there has been a kind of range of ways in which this has been framed. One is about kind of just the democratic process, but others have used the word fascism, right? So I want to get this on the table. I'm wondering how people assess and what is the language of danger we should be, is your sense that we're confronting at this moment? Is it, in fact, a blistering individual, but who will still be controlled by the institutions of our democracy? Or do we worry that, in fact, even the fundamental practice of democracy is at odds right now and is on the brink here? Yeah.
I can speak for myself personally and say, as I said before, I don't think this is about partisan politics. I wouldn't be saying what I'm saying had anyone else won, had Ted Cruz won, had Marco Rubio won, even had Mike Pence, right, been the nominee. I think, for me, again, just looking at what's happened in Russia and the rapidity with which it's happened, I think we're in real trouble here. And so I'm worried about fundamental democratic institutions, as you say, the free press, right, the First Amendment, all of these things I think are on the table. Yeah.
So I think that there's no doubt that the free press is in deep danger. I think that when we say fascism, though, what we're often thinking about is the executive controlling the powers of government to use them to, and I think this is, and Faith, you know this, of course, better, but this is, I think, part of what people think of when they think of Putin. I think at least in the next few years, it's going to be very difficult for Trump to use the power of the executive branch in that way. So I think what you're seeing with the CIA right now, what you're seeing is a battle between Trump and not one person, but like 30,000 people, okay? And they're not all resigning, but that doesn't mean they're all gonna go and support Trump either. So I think that what you're gonna end up with, and this looks like in other possible cabinet posts as well, is basically a battle here between Trump and the actual powers that be, the bureaucracy that does things. And so I think what, at least in the first few years here, you may just see things grinding to a total halt. And so it's not the CIA will assassinate somebody on his orders. They just aren't going to be doing anything. You see, it's sort of like what we've seen in some other cases. And I think that now maybe a couple years after that, he could clean house for real, because he would really need to replace not just 2,000 people, but tens of thousands of people, closer to probably 200,000 to really get his way.
Yeah, go ahead.
F word either.
Well, yes, people don't.
Historians argue in great detail about what constitutes fascism. I don't think that's the appropriate word here, but one of the key words that came out is the word that Adam first used, which is illiberal.
Illiberal.
And the rise of illiberal systems around the world. I think that's important. I think another important word, I agree, it's going to be complex how this plays out, to what extent Republicans are acquiescent, to what extent they aren't, to what extent the executive branch works or doesn't. But there are these clear authoritarian tendencies that are visible in Trump, but also in his supporters. And then I think the third component I'd throw in there is also this kleptocratic element, which is actually a totally new element in American politics that we have not seen before. And we don't know what's happening because we don't know what his interests are, right, per se. And so this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the demise of institutions, right? So,
And one of the things that I think maybe we have to take care to try to do is not grade this on the curve of administrative accomplishment, but grade this instead on the curve of public expectations. Where are people in terms of what they expect from political systems? I mean, something that I think you're speaking to very directly in terms of Russia. I think, Liz, you were talking about in terms of the expectations and the ways in which people misread what government, in fact, is actually able to provide for them. And I think this idea about information and what are the kind of means by which people are able to make judgments about function, efficiency, capacity is itself important. I think that whether or not there's a kind of grinding to a halt or a sort of quick march forward, what it's going to mean in terms of the ways in which American people come to have lowered expectations of what they can expect from this or any other administration is itself consequential. And then, which I think is a different question, how do we read this in relation to the ways in which this move towards a liberalism appears to be happening, in a certain kind of coordination at many, many points within the world? Again, I mean, the cases that I brought up are only a few. We've got a series of consequential elections that are happening in Western Europe over the next year, all of which may actually veer in the same direction that we've seen thus far across this year. That's going to have its own effect on the ways in which people within those countries have expectations about their governments. So I think at that point, we're not really sort of keeping score on where the administrations are. We're trying to take a temperature in relation to what the health is of civil society in each of these various places.
Joe, you wanted to?
Really wonderful comments, really carefully considered evaluations. Following up on Bob's great point, there is this opening move with the evaluation of the EPA in which, there was a request for a list of all the people that had worked on climate change. And so this idea that attending to who is, who are the civil servants, who are the scientists, who are the intelligence officers who actually make the machinery of government work is something that's already being considered in that sense. And then I'm just struck by this potential that we have within the American democratic scene that the mechanisms actually of democracy itself were used to choose Trump. And there's something about an outsider who was rejected by most of the establishment figures outside of a certain world in finance, perhaps, who didn't spend much money on the campaign, who basically systematically tried to offend every constituent, winning, using the very mechanisms of democratic order that I think we have to really assess what the implications of that are, and also what the implications are for other figures with radically different politics coming through with a similar kind of surprising outsider status. And then finally, we have an undisclosed problem in the FBI in this election. And so part of the problem going forward with the national security community is also the question of how the CIA and the FBI are going to understand this election. And I think we haven't seen that kind of a problem, like the question of the basic legitimacy of one of the major intelligence agencies before.
Great. Liz, you want to?
Yes, picking up on this point that we shouldn't assume that there is already a coherent consolidation of power and control, regardless of how dramatic the election was. I think it's actually important to recognize that there are multiple projects moving here. And one of the big projects behind the congressional majority is not this unpredictable, volatile figure who may create all kinds of catastrophes, but at the same time this creates opportunities for a consistent, methodical project that we tend to associate with organizations such as Alex or folks such as the Koch brothers. And this is the boring and technical project of change that is very directed, very thoughtful, very tactically sophisticated, and that we may lose sight of. Whether you agree with their goals or not, I would say that while the band of what might be a future produced by that project is much narrower than it is in the case of Trump, the odds of them transforming intentions into outcomes are considerably higher.
Great. Well, thank you all for having this panel. It's been a wonderful talk so far. My question, I want to kind of return to this idea of Trump at the top of an authoritarian structure and this idea of an illiberal democracy. How much of this is kind of reports of the death of liberal democracy are greatly exaggerated right now? How much can he actually do on his own? One of the comments earlier was he really doesn't have an inner circle outside of his family, and the coalition that he's put together in his cabinet pretty much only seems linked by the fact that they're really rich. So, like taking this chart as an example, how much could Trump really get troop numbers down to, say, 0, if he's opposed by someone like General Mattis, or in the Senate by senators like John McCain or Lindsey Graham?
So in terms of reducing troops down to 0, he has an enormous amount of power. If Mattis won't do it, he'll just fire him and find somebody who will. So this is not Mattis as a institutional constraint on the power of the president. And over the last 70 years, what we have done is we have basically given the president more and more and more power and at his discretion to use particularly military force. And this is something that drove a lot of people very upset who wanted to get into Bosnia. You remember in the 90s, we couldn't do it despite all that public pressure and so forth. And so actually what you're seeing is he has an enormous amount of power when it comes to military troops.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, you want to add, please?
In 2001 is still operative for the war on terror. So, the basic mechanism for deterring all future terrorist acts as the president deems them dangers is still in place.
All right, so let's go to that mic.
I really had a kind of follow-up to the last question, that given that all of Trump's national security nominees in their Senate confirmation hearings disagree with Trump about the importance of American alliances, can they resist Trump? And although he could, of course, could say you're fired, that would greatly diminish his influence. And so I wonder how much Congress backing the national security nominees, and maybe more important, public opinion, so that there might be a reaction to the post-truth era, that exactly because of the post-truth era and because of obfuscation, because the issues in a way are so clear, there could be an actual resurgence to belief in truth, and that public opinion plus the power of Congress plus that if Trump actually did fire Mattis or Tillerson, that would be a huge blow. And so I'm really getting to make it a follow-up to ask what ideas are important, like what might lead to impeachment if someone is too much under foreign influences because he fires Mattis.
So just to add to what I said before, so Trump also is about to gain a power that he's already been very good at using, but much, much more powerful, which is the bully pulpit. So what Trump has been a master of over the last year is manipulating threats, security threats, and using them to his domestic advantage. And this is something that we've seen in other politicians, like, say, Slobodan Milosevic in other countries. We have not seen this in the United States. And Obama, actually, and also other presidents as well, have tried to calm, fear. The greatest thing we have to fear is fear itself. What you are seeing is a person who, as candidate, and now he will have the power of the bully pulpit to manipulate that fear. What that does is it's the fear of our personal insecurity which drives the Patriot Act. It's not, the Patriot Act didn't get passed in 1994, okay? It get passed after 9/11 when there's tremendous fear by the public. It's the fear that's causing the public to be willing to get rid of or diminish its constitutional rights. What Trump now has that we have not seen in the hands of anybody else is a master of manipulating fear to reduce constitutional rights, and he now has the power of the bully pulpit. So I understand, Robert, your point. I think that it's a smart point. I just don't think we've quite really fully seen Trump using the powers of the presidency. The presidency is enormously powerful office. The founders, as a lot of people in this room know better than I do, went to great lengths to restrain the power of the presidency, especially in security affairs. We've taken a lot of those restraints off in the last 70 years, and we are now going to find out what it means to not have those restraints.
Issue, because I know a lot of people were surprised that he seemed to say all the right things in the hearing. I think the question is, now that there is this daylight, what happens if Tillerson continues to say all the right things about sanctions, about Crimea, et cetera, and Trump doesn't, right? Can Tillerson actually go and credibly negotiate? Not really. It really undercuts him. It's my understanding that different departments have, DOD, for example, may have more autonomy, but Tillerson in particular, I think, is hamstrung if he's negotiating with Russia, and then Trump is off tweeting something contrary, right?
Great.
So I'd like to direct this question primarily towards Professor Mulligan. So in a recent survey of Trump supporters, many said that they supported the Affordable Care Act, but not Obamacare. And when asked why, the primary reason cited was that they don't like Obama. I really appreciated your analogy with the dog food. But I was wondering if you could address the suggestion that it wasn't the product that voters had an issue with, it was the seller.
As I said, you're not a person if you don't put value on the intangibles, and that would be part of the intangible. Again, shame on Mrs. Clinton for not straightening that out. But there's also tangibles involved. There's people there, they may not know what the ACA is or the Patient Protection Act, but there are some of those people who don't have those jobs, and they know that they don't have a job, okay? And they know that their neighbors don't have jobs, and they don't like that. And Mrs. Clinton wasn't about to do anything different than Mr. Obama was doing, and they didn't like the product. The dogs didn't like it, and hopefully someone will pull the product off the shelf. It's too bad they gave Trump the opportunity to be the guy who's the savior on that, but that's what's been done.
All right, we'll go over here.
All right. Hi there. I had a question about the future of political activism in the age of Trump, because on the one hand, like, the future kind of looks dismal. I mean, we've seen already laws proposed by likes of the governor of North Dakota to empower police to more, strongly police political activists in the public sphere. He's made no subtleties about how he felt about, like, Standing Rock protesters and all that, what powers he'd like to give to police to prevent such things from happening again. But on the other hand, if it's true, as Professor Cohen intimated, that the success of some of the Trump administration's policies will depend on the level at which, contentious politics could be used to, obfuscate, the reality of, how much they grasp the institutional levers they need to, make these a reality. I mean, you can make the argument that it might not be in the Trump administration's best interest to necessarily restrain political activism across the board. I mean, keep in mind the influence of Tea Partiers behind the Trump movement in the first place and the methods grassroots activism they adopted. So I guess all this is to ask, is it very clear-cut at this point what the policy of the Trump administration from the federal government standpoint at least will be to political activism and, you know, I guess the right to express political opinions in public space from here on? Is it very clear what that policy will be and what its consequences will be at this point?
I mean, one of the things that I think perhaps can give some confidence, some inspiration to the other side is from that point to also go back to history. I mean, think about the conditions of what it meant, say, to protest in the South in relation to civil rights struggles in the mid-1950s and 1960s. Believe me, police power had very few restraints, for instance, in relation to dealing with people as we see in terms of many different episodes. Think in relation to labor organizing during the 1930s or at even earlier decades in relation to that. I mean, I think what's going to happen is that it's going to grow more contentious. And people are going to have to think strategically and tactically about how to operate within a more contentious environment. And there are precedents for thinking about that. There are parallel examples in terms of thinking about organizing in countries like Turkey and elsewhere in relation to how people combat those sorts of circumstances and that kind of aggrandizing of power. So, you know, I think in some ways, clearly it's going to change, and it's hard to predict specifically chapter and verse. Others may be able to do that. What will be some of the moves in order to quell popular opposition to either proposals or actual commitments and interests on the part of this administration? But there are plenty of examples to think about the ways in which people operate in more contentious environments in this country's history and elsewhere.
Along those same points, I would say there are kind of two ways, at least I've been thinking about it. I think if you are in support of dissent and protests, in a way that's surprising, this has been a kind of clarifying moment. I think we've seen organizations that had vowed not to work with each other come together because, in fact, they see a greater threat in the Trump administration. We've also seen the capacity, whether it's foundations or donors, kind of mobilizing and providing extra resources. So I think the infrastructure for kind of civic engagement and dissent has actually expanded at this moment. And another reason for the expansion has been, I think there was confusion at times when confronting the Obama administration. It wasn't clear, in fact, if you wanted to be that organization or that group that in particular targeted the state, and there were also ways in which the Obama administration came to engage with activists and kind of pulled them into a process, a policy process. I think activists understand right now that the Justice Department will no longer in any way protect their rights, whether it's from voting or to protesting. So I think there is a clarity, but there's going to be an increased danger, no doubt. But I think, in fact, we may see more continuous activism than we saw for the last 8 years.
I would just add that it's going to be more contentious, it's going to be more risky, it's going to be more fraught in many ways. So it becomes really important to think about the theory of change in which dissent and protest figure, right? That often that there's sort of a gap there, that the point is the protest, not to think about how the protest makes something else happen. And I think the price of stopping at the protest is only going to grow higher.
Thank you.
Thanks. Over here.
Cathy, Cohen sort of preempted some of my question, which is the banal one of what is to be done, especially in protest, and especially by students. I'm Marshall Solins, retired professor of anthropology, retired so long that I think I'm post emeritus. But it's relevant that I mentioned these personal coordinates because the problem of student activism is an important one relative to what happened in the 60s and 70s when student activism raised the consciousness of the nation became the vanguard of the movement against the government action in Vietnam. The situation has changed radically since then, and I wonder if it's changed beyond redemption about student mass protests. In 1970, the number of bachelor's degrees in the social sciences, including history, but excluding economics, vastly outnumbered, or significantly outnumbered, the number of bachelor's degrees in business-related subjects. In 2014, the number of bachelor's degrees in business-related subjects was more than twice as many as the number of all social science degrees, including history. And in fact, more than double all social science degrees, and more than all social science and humanities degrees. Beside that, we have the problem that our students, except for the very rich, are more and more becoming victims of debt peonage to the business order by virtue of the debts that they contract and which force them into all kinds of jobs which they might not have wanted to be in. So my question is, what can the students do, and can we recover, especially also, there's a whole other problem I won't go into, the divided nature of the politics of today. It's the identity politics, diversity politics, important as they are fragmenting the structure of the protest. But the question then is, what can we do? What can the students do? Can they once more organize and be the vanguard of the consciousness of the nation, which is their future?
Before anybody would give an answer, of course, we have to acknowledge that there are no students on the panel. So that's a question that I think is engaged by many who are engaged in organizing here and elsewhere in the city. One thing that I guess I would point out is that a lesson of this election was that the group of people that reside within colleges and universities such as this one presume a far greater authority to be able to predict what will be the direction of elections or various other kinds of developments in society than sometimes proves to be the case. In this city alone, and I think it's something that's been borne out by groups like Black Lives Matters, BYP 100, there are plenty of cross-institutional, higher education involved, and with groups that are not involved in higher education, groups of youth that have engaged in very creative and very effective organizing. And I think there are lots of opportunities, actually, I would suggest, very humbly to students, to think about going beyond a campus that one finds oneself at, and beginning to think about federations and alliances and cross-community groups that are able to be quite effective in ways that might actually pose a very powerful answer and not necessarily get rid of one or the other, a class-oriented politics or an identity-driven politics, but recognize the consonances between those that I think are actually quite powerful.
And I think these young people would also, first of all, I wouldn't reify the position of student. I think there are young people who are engaged in struggle already across the city and across the country. And so while I hope, and I think we all have a responsibility, if we can, to provide kind of support for students who are interested in being activists, I'm not dependent on students, especially at predominantly white elite institutions, to provide the consciousness for the country. I think there are already organizations who are kind of mapping that agenda. And I guess I would also push back a bit on this idea that identity politics, or I guess you called it diversity politics, has fragmented the movement. I would suggest, in fact, that they are speaking to the kind of larger condition of the country, but quite often because people only are able to engage in a politics that they can recognize as directly relevant to them. And I might say class politics to me falls into that category, because it's usually about the white working class as opposed to a kind of broader understanding of how class operates in kind of multiple positions and places, for example, even in a place like Chicago, a city like Chicago. So I think there are all kinds of wonderful possibilities at this moment. Some of them will be born and operate and live in universities. Others will be operating at a Chicago state. Others will be kind of on the streets on the south side of Chicago and internationally. So I think it's an incredible moment. When we think about the capacity for protests and the protests that we've seen over the last 4 years, for example, since the killing of Trayvon Martin, I think we have to kind of step back and say, in fact, we are in a moment of momentum, and how do we continue that momentum? Instead of, this is just my perspective, instead of suggesting that there is a loss there or an absence there.
So, Cathy, could I just, so I think, Marshall, I think you're definitely right that there has been a shift in the numbers, as you said. One of the things I think that, though, that misses is that there, in the last 15 years, has been a dramatic increase in the number of undergraduates in particular that have a hunger for public engagement. That's what you see in IOP and in my center, Poast, which doesn't just do peer-reviewed research, which we do, but we also every term, every week, have over 25 interns who are spending 10 hours a week to contribute to that research. And not all of them are going to go on to PhD programs. Some of them do. Some go into government. Some go into the military. Some do go into private life. But what is really striking is that there is a hunger here among the undergraduates to engage. It's not always the same type of engagement. It's not simply protest or research or the IOP type events. It's a whole collection of those. And that's really changed since I was here in the 1980s, where we did have undergraduates, but they were very more narrow strand. I think we have much more variety. I don't think we are giving them as many opportunities here to fulfill that hunger, and I think that over time we should.
If I could just add, institutions like this are also part of the process that moves people around the map and produce the divergence between the popular vote and the electoral vote, right? Places like this draw students nationally, and I think one of the things to do, in addition to protest of all sorts, is if you come from a purple or a red place, keep in touch. Don't make it easy for your political positions to be demonized. Think about moving back there, because the geographical sorting across political units is really central to understanding this moment.
Mm-hmm. How are we doing, Paul? 2 more questions, okay, right there.
Hi, Casey, I think you were actually the only person who brought up the fact that Hillary ran a really, really bad campaign. She had a layup. She was facing possibly the most unpopular candidate in history, and she chose to campaign on, I'm with her and America is already great. And to me, that did not resonate with anybody. And I think that speaks to the broader failures of the central liberal technocracy in this country, which fails to give people any sort of an alternative to Trumpism that's really, that really sparks their interest, that gets them passionate. And even now, as Trump is taking power, we're seeing a lot of Democrats in the Senate who are doing these things, capitulating in ways that we never would have expected them to. You know, you got Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's probably one of the most left-leaning people in the Senate, who just helped to swear in a war criminal, Mattis, into the, so in what way do you propose that Democrats, as they exist right now, can fight back?
Get a good leader.
Addendum, Bernie would have won.
I'd like to think that telling the truth is going to be a successful strategy in the long run, and the Obama administration was was not doing that, and the press was not doing that. And it maybe gave them some short-term gains, but now look what they are. Their policies are about to go out the window because people understand that it was oversold and so on. So that would be my humble recommendation.
You know, I'll just provide, it's not at all a full answer to that, but just an observation. My mother grew up in rural Michigan, North Michigan in a county, Ogemaw County. And I looked after the election at the results from that county, and I believe it delivered 2,000 of the 10,000 votes that Donald Trump won by. Barack Obama won that county in 2008, and he lost that county by, I think, 4 percentage points to Romney in 2012. So there are many, many things that the Democratic Party needs to do and think about. There's a lot of soul searching. This DNC race is actually very, very important in relation to thinking about the direction of the party and whether it sort of commits itself to this idea of a 50-state strategy, or it imagines that the base, the coalition that was able to elect Obama twice, is one that actually represents an important base to build on in relation to elections. But let's not go too far in terms of thinking about the postmortem around this election in terms of, just complete vacuity and complete irrelevance in relation to the positions that were there. Because for 2 elections before this, many of the same voters who voted for Donald Trump voted for a black president. That's something that's going to take some time to figure out how to analyze, despite the non-delivery in relation to different policies that were there, that I think also needs to be thought about. But still, those 2 elections need to be factored in terms of thinking about future directions around the other side of this politically.
Should we go here?
This is a question for Professor Cohen and Professor Green. So I've been, trying my best to follow this election in terms of its ecological and economic and all these kind of implications. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, every single day I wake up and I'm a person of color and I'm a woman of color, and I feel this election very viscerally. And I want to center, because this conversation has not been about race mostly, and I want to recenter that and ask, what does this mean for women of color and marginalized populations, and what does this mean not only for women of color in the United States, but what does it mean, across the globe in terms of that kind of movement and coalition, and also, to an audience of white allies or professors that are white allies, what responsibility do you have, and what can be done, to hold people accountable to what has happened, and the hatred that I feel toward my body every day.
Well, you want to go first? Well, as I started my comments and ended my comments and focused my comments on the question of race. I think it is unconscionable to think about this election, not, of course, including everything that has been said, but also with the realization that, in fact, there is, as we already know, a kind of significant racial divide, but there's also a way in which our politics, I think, mask the kind of not just the difficulties of folks of color and communities of color, but in fact the very different lived experiences that different segments of the country have. So, for example, the point of kind of talking about the working class, it seems to me that when we focus only on the white working class, first of all, we misdiagnose what happened. And if we look at the numbers, the average income of a Trump voter was about $72,000, far above the working class. So this is not just an issue about the white working class. And I think it goes back to this question of why, it's not just kind of why did whites who voted for Trump then vote for Obama, but I think it's a larger question of why did whites who could hear the racist comments daily, the misogyny, how could people still bring themselves? And I think it has so much to do not only with Trump, but Trump's opportunity. I'm trying to talk to you. But in many ways, it also, and this is a hard thing for us, talks about the failures of the Obama administration and I think a policy of neoliberalism that the Democrats have embraced for a very long time, not thinking about the constraints and the concerns of the working class, but in particular the working class in communities of color, right? And so what do? I understand that you feel that your body, you feel that you said the hatred of your body, towards your body?
Well, I feel like a lot of POC and a lot of other, like trans and women of color would say that, it's visceral, right? Like every day, like you feel it, walking down the street, waking up in the morning.
Right. I have to say, I think we have to figure out kind of where we organize and how we hold people accountable. The day after the election, I was giving a talk in Maryland, and so had to get on a plane at 6 a.m. And this is the truth. I walked through the airport, and I saw nothing but white people, and I wondered, did you vote for Trump? Right? Because in fact, it felt like that vote was a vote against me and my body and my community. Now, that said, I think that communities of color have a broader vision and lived experience that speak both to our concerns, but really speak to the concerns also of the white working class, right? This has to be an issue about how, in fact, do we empower and improve the lives of people who struggle every day to kind of make minimum wage, to provide for quality education for their children, who want access to health care. And clearly that's rooted undoubtedly in communities of color. So therefore, communities of color have to provide that leadership. But it's not an issue of identity politics. It's an issue of a kind of lived and empowered experience that we hope for people when they talk about living the American dream. And it seems to me that we have to claim that central component of a broad vision of politics that is about liberating lots of people who struggle and who feel oppressed, right? But also recognizing, and this, I know I'm going on and on, also recognizing that just because you're a woman of color, I'm a woman of color, our positioning is not the same also, right? You come to the University of Chicago. I teach at the University of Chicago. So not to understand the privileges that are also involved in that type of positioning within communities of color, I think would also be a mistake. So, Adam.
Lily, I'll be very, very quick because I think Cathy touched most of the bases, as she always does, incredibly powerfully and incredibly eloquently. The state's not going to have your back. And that's clear. That's something that I think also was complicated to figure out in the context of the Obama administration. That's now resolved. That's been the case before, but there are different communities that are facing different kinds of challenges, and there are different ways in which oppression gets acted onto people that are going to have to be accounted for in terms of organizing, in terms of thinking about how one engages in resistance, in terms of imagining both the communities and the politics that one wants to enact. That's something that's going to happen organically because it's not going to find really any sort of support in relation to state action and state orientation. I think the other thing too, though, is that given the clarity of the moment, as Cathy pointed out, but perhaps a little optimistically, we're going to have to think about where new coalitions begin to form and what are some of the complicated issues that are going to have to be worked out. So let's say that the Supreme Court is remade with 2 or 3 justices and reproductive choice is in fact taken off as something that's protected by law. There's been this precedent, of course, to think about the ways in which people operated in the 60s and 70s. One uncomfortable tension was the way in which people who were trying to encourage the defense of reproductive rights were seen as engaging in a kind of population management or overt sterilization process from the standpoint of some communities of color that were led primarily by male leaders. That's going to be something that, if we face it, hopefully we'll do a better job of thinking through and addressing in terms of addressing what those kinds of issues mean. Similarly, various kinds of forms of legislation at the state level that were trying to suppress or restrict the rights of LGBTQ people, those were at times things that were supported and endorsed by particularly religious communities of color. That's going to have to be something that people are going to have to be rethinking going forward. So at the same time that we invoke the possibility of new coalitions, there are going to be real new challenges in terms of understanding what it means for people to ally with one another, and not just white people with community of color, but also the ways in which communities of color themselves think about these issues. That's going to be an opportunity, but it's certainly going to be a challenge.
I think we have to turn it over to Paul.
Yeah, so with that response, this concludes tonight's roundtable, Talking Trump. Just a few general remarks about the nature of what we saw tonight. The goal of this event was to demonstrate a productive mode of discourse surrounding a highly controversial topic. I think there's no doubt about that. One that is best confronted from a broad range of perspectives. This is something that social science, by its very nature, does well. Social science is a field comprised of many disciplines, but social science is also aware, as was displayed tonight with this panel, interdisciplinary collaboration can work well. The University of Chicago is known for challenging ideas and providing healthy soil for intellectual growth. I hope tonight's event showcased the best of what the university can achieve when it comes to academic discourse surrounding real-world circumstances. With that, a few follow-up events. One, we hope to be able to hold another event of this type approximately, say, 100 days from now. To take stock of the initiatives and the events that will transpire between now and then. There'll be more on that to come. Furthermore, more immediately, tomorrow, I have an announcement here. The Department of History is holding an event, Conversations on Trump, Part 2. Part 2 is What Does a Trump Presidency Mean? It'll be comprised of a panel of individuals from the History Department, and it'll be from 2 to 5 p.m. in the Stepanovich Center for Financial Mathematics building. There can be more. There's been a host of flyers around that throughout campus. So there'll be more events, more to come. But for now, thank you for your and good evening.